September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay, the morning air hung thick with humidity and the smell of oil as the USS Missouri swayed gently in the calm waters. On her deck, beneath the shadow of her 16-inch guns, representatives of the Empire of Japan stood in formal dress, their faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed on the documents before them. General Douglas MacArthur's voice carried across the wooden planks as he spoke of hope and reconciliation, but his words seemed to dissolve into the vastness of the moment. Beneath the ceremony, beneath the cameras and the assembled witnesses from a dozen nations, lay a question no one yet dared to ask aloud: what happens now? The war had ended, but the infrastructure of that war, the greatest naval expansion in human history, remained. From the frozen harbors of Alaska to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, from the volcanic beaches of Iceland to the steaming jungles of the Philippines, the United States Navy had constructed a maritime empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. Over 400 major installations, thousands of anchorages, fuel depots, repair facilities, airfields, ammunition dumps, hospitals, and supply warehouses. Entire artificial harbors had been dredged from reef and rock. Islands that appeared on no pre-war maps now hosted populations larger than American cities, complete with power plants, desalination facilities, bakeries capable of producing 50,000 loaves of bread per day, and Quonset hut cities stretching to the horizon. The Japanese officers signing the surrender documents that morning had witnessed firsthand the terrifying efficiency of this system. They had watched as American task forces, supplied and repaired at forward bases thousands of miles from the continental United States, had ground their empire into dust. They had marveled, though they would never admit it publicly, at the ability of the U.S. Navy to maintain a tempo of operations that never slowed, never faltered, never ran out of fuel or ammunition or food. The secret had not been superior courage or fighting spirit. It had been logistics, industrial capacity. And now, with the guns finally silent, that capacity faced its greatest challenge. What do you do with an empire built for war when peace arrives? Admiral Raymond Spruance, architect of victories at Midway and the Philippine Sea, had once remarked that the Pacific War had been won not by carriers or battleships, but by floating dry docks and fleet oilers. The unglamorous vessels, the bases no one photographed for Life magazine. In the euphoria of victory, as sailors threw their caps in the air and cities across America erupted in celebration, the men who understood naval logistics lay awake at night contemplating spreadsheets and cargo manifests. The U.S. Navy now operated more bases than the British Empire had maintained at its zenith. The annual cost of maintaining these facilities, even in peacetime, exceeded the entire defense budget of most nations. Congress, already eyeing conversion to a peacetime economy, would not tolerate such expenditure for long. But abandoning these bases carried its own terrible calculus. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands, November 1945. 3 months after the surrender, Ulithi remained one of the busiest harbors on Earth. The atoll, a ring of coral barely rising above sea level, enclosing a lagoon large enough to anchor the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet, had been unknown to most Americans before the war. Now it housed over 600 ships and 20,000 personnel. Floating dry docks the size of city blocks bobbed in the turquoise water. Fuel barges pumped thousands of gallons of oil per hour into thirsty carriers and battleships. On Mog Mog Island, Seabees had constructed a recreation facility complete with a baseball diamond, beer gardens, and an open-air cinema that showed the latest Hollywood films to audiences of sunburned sailors who had spent months at sea. Lieutenant Commander James Holloway III, a destroyer officer awaiting orders home, walked the coral paths of the base and felt a strange melancholy. Everything here had been built with such urgency, such purpose. The Seabees had arrived in September 1944, found nothing but coconut palms and reef, and within weeks had transformed Ulithi into the forward logistics hub that supported the invasion of the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They had dredged channels, erected fuel tanks, assembled floating piers, and created a mobile city that moved with the advancing fleet. Now, in the eerie calm of peacetime, the base felt like a ghost town still bustling with the living. The Navy Department's orders were clear, but contradictory: begin demobilization. Return personnel to the continental United States as rapidly as possible, but maintain readiness. Preserve strategic flexibility. Do not abandon positions that might be needed in the future. The result was chaos. Some bases received orders to shut down immediately, stripping usable equipment and scuttling what couldn't be transported. Others remained fully operational, their commanders receiving no guidance about their ultimate fate. Rumors spread faster than official communications. Ulithi would become a permanent base. No, Ulithi would be returned to its native inhabitants. No, Ulithi would be mothballed, maintained by a skeleton crew. No one knew. Perhaps no one had decided. What the sailors and officers at Ulithi couldn't know, was that similar conversations were taking place at Pearl Harbor, at Guam, at Subic Bay, at Adak, at dozens of installations across 2 oceans. In Washington, in the temporary offices that still housed much of the Navy Department's expanded wartime staff, admirals and civilian administrators pored over maps and argued about the future. Some advocated a return to pre-war posture, a smaller Navy, concentrated at a handful of major bases, focused on defending the Western Hemisphere. Others, haunted by the memory of how unpreparedness had led to Pearl Harbor, insisted on maintaining a forward presence. The world had changed. America had changed. The luxury of isolation had been purchased with 400,000 American lives. Could the nation afford to retreat back into hemispheric defense? And then there was the matter of the Soviets. Even as Japan surrendered, even as American servicemen dreamed of going home, intelligence reports painted a troubling picture. The Soviet Union, bled white by 4 years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front, had nonetheless emerged as the dominant land power in Eurasia. Stalin's armies occupied Eastern Europe. Soviet influence spread through the Balkans, through Manchuria, through Northern Korea. The wartime alliance, always an uncomfortable marriage of necessity, was already showing cracks. In classified briefings, Navy planners asked uncomfortable questions. If conflict with the Soviet Union became inevitable, where would America's forward bases be? The Soviets had no blue water navy to speak of, but they had submarines. They had long-range bombers. They had ambitions that stretched from Berlin to the Pacific. The bases built to defeat Japan might be needed to contain the Soviet Union, but no one wanted to say this aloud. Not yet. Not while American mothers were demanding their sons come home. Not while Congress slashed defense appropriations. Not while the entire nation exhaled after 4 years of total war. So the bases existed in limbo, neither fully maintained nor completely abandoned, staffed by skeleton crews who didn't understand their mission, supplied by a logistics system slowly winding down, defended against an enemy that no longer existed while a new threat quietly took shape. Subic Bay, Philippines. January 1946. The heat at Subic Bay was murderous, even by tropical standards. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, a supply officer from Nebraska, stepped off the transport ship into air so thick with moisture it felt like breathing through a wet towel. The naval base here had been a modest American facility before the war, abandoned during the Japanese invasion, recaptured in 1945, and now transformed into one of the Navy's largest overseas installations. Quonset huts stretched in orderly rows across what had been jungle 6 months earlier. Massive fuel tanks, painted white to reflect the sun, dominated the hills overlooking the bay. The harbor itself bristled with piers and dry docks, most of them still under construction by Filipino workers and the remaining Seabees. Anderson's orders were simple and impossible: inventory everything. Determine what should be shipped back to the United States, what should be left in place, what should be sold or destroyed. The Navy Department wanted answers within 60 days. He looked at the sprawling base, thousands of structures, millions of pieces of equipment, supplies ranging from aircraft engines to typewriters to frozen beef, and laughed bitterly. This was the work of years, not weeks. What Anderson discovered, as he dove into the task, was that no one actually knew what existed at Subic Bay. The frantic pace of wartime construction had overwhelmed record-keeping. Requisitions had been filed, supplies shipped, equipment installed, all without proper documentation. In one warehouse, he found row upon row of brand-new aircraft propellers, still in their factory crating, enough to supply every plane in the Pacific Fleet twice over. No one knew why they were there. No one had ordered them moved. They had simply accumulated, like sediment, as the great river of American industrial production flowed westward. In another depot, he found medical supplies sufficient to stock 20 hospitals. Plasma, penicillin, surgical instruments, bandages measured not in thousands but in millions. All of it still fresh, still usable, now gathering mildew in the tropical heat because no one had orders to move it or use it or dispose of it. The waste was staggering. It was also inevitable. Wars are not won by careful accounting. They are won by overwhelming material superiority, by ensuring that no unit ever runs out of ammunition or fuel or food, even if that means shipping 10 times what is actually needed. But peace demanded different calculations. The Filipino workers who helped Anderson with his inventory task told him stories. They had been here when the Japanese occupied Subic Bay. They had seen the brutality of occupation, the systematic stripping of resources, the hunger that came when the Japanese Empire's logistics system, always fragile, always insufficient, finally collapsed. They had watched Japanese soldiers, once proud conquerors, reduced to scavenging for food, their equipment held together with rope and scavenged parts, their ammunition rationed to a handful of rounds per man. And then the Americans had returned, not hungry, not desperate, not making do with scraps. The Americans arrived with everything, mountains of supplies, fuel in quantities that seemed impossible, food so abundant that the mess halls threw away more each day than entire Filipino villages ate in a week. The contrast was not subtle, it was overwhelming. It was the physical manifestation of industrial democracy versus military autocracy. The Japanese had told the Filipinos they were liberating Asia from Western imperialism, building a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But liberation, it turned out, looked like starvation and slave labor. American occupation looked like Quonset huts and ice cream machines and bases that seemed to materialize from nothing. This was the paradox Anderson grappled with as he filed his reports. The bases represented waste on an almost incomprehensible scale. They also represented something deeper, proof that democratic societies, when mobilized, could outproduce any totalitarian system. The Japanese had believed that American civilians, soft from peacetime prosperity, would lack the will to fight a long war. They had believed that a nation divided by class and race could never match the unity of purpose that came from emperor worship and martial discipline. They had been catastrophically wrong. The bases proved it. Every gallon of fuel, every ton of concrete, every air-conditioned barracks and refrigerated warehouse was a testament to what a free society could accomplish when threatened. The Japanese had built their empire on conquest and extraction. The Americans had built theirs on production and logistics. One system had collapsed into barbarism. The other had built Subic Bay. But now Subic Bay had no purpose. The enemy was defeated. The threat was gone. And Congress wanted to know why the Navy Department needed to maintain a base the size of a major city on the far side of the Pacific. Anderson filed his report. It was 50 pages long and answered nothing. Adak Island, Alaska, March 1946. Snow fell sideways across the runways at Adak, driven by winds that came howling down from the Bering Sea. This was the Aleutian Islands, a volcanic chain stretching toward Asia, where the weather was so consistently terrible that pilots called it the birthplace of storms. The naval base here had been carved from tundra and rock in 1942, after Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, the only American territory invaded during the war. The campaign to retake the Aleutians had been brutal, fought in freezing rain, in snow, in fog so thick that men literally couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Now, in early 1946, Adak remained operational, though most of its wartime population had departed. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, one of the Navy's few female officers stationed at remote bases, oversaw the weather station that provided meteorological data for transpacific flights. The isolation was profound. The nearest city was Anchorage, over 1,000 miles away. Supply ships arrived every 2 weeks, weather permitting. The wind never stopped. The sky was gray. The rocks were gray. The buildings were gray. Everything tasted of salt and diesel fuel. Mitchell had volunteered for Adak because she believed in the mission. Weather data from the Aleutians was critical for aviation safety. The upper atmosphere patterns that formed over the North Pacific influenced weather across the entire northern hemisphere. The research being conducted here had scientific value beyond military applications. But she also understood that Adak's real importance was strategic. If tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, and every classified briefing suggested they would, the Aleutian Islands would become the front line. Alaska sat closer to Moscow than to Washington, D.C. bombers. Flying from Soviet bases could reach American cities via polar routes. Adak would be needed. The question was whether Congress would fund it, whether the American public would accept maintaining military installations in places they couldn't find on a map, against threats they didn't want to think about. The easy narrative, the one that dominated newspapers and radio broadcasts, was that America had won the war, the boys were coming home, and life could return to normal. The complex reality, that victory had made America responsible for maintaining global security, that the infrastructure built to win the war might be needed to prevent the next one, didn't fit into headlines. Mitchell walked the perimeter of the base, past Quonset huts half buried in snowdrifts, past fuel tanks that had been filled and drained and filled again countless times, past the concrete foundations where anti-aircraft guns had once stood watch against Japanese bombers that never came. She thought about the men who had built this place, Seabees working in sub-zero temperatures, Army engineers blasting rock with dynamite, civilian contractors who signed up for hazard pay and found themselves in hell. They had built ADAC because it was necessary. They had built it to last. And now the question was whether it would be allowed to last. Whether the American people, weary of war and sacrifice, would understand that peace required vigilance. That the bases were not just relics of past victory but insurance against future conflict. The Japanese had gambled that American democracy was weak, that a free society couldn't sustain the discipline needed for total war. They had lost that bet. Now a different gamble loomed. Could American democracy sustain the discipline needed for total peace? Could a nation that wanted nothing more than to forget about war maintain the infrastructure that made war unthinkable? No one knew. The snow kept falling. The wind kept blowing. The base remained operational, waiting for a decision that hadn't been made. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, June 1946. 10 months after Japan's surrender, Pearl Harbor was still the nerve center of the Pacific Fleet, but its character had changed. The urgency was gone. The sense of desperate purpose that had animated every activity during the war had been replaced by routine. Ships came and went, but fewer of them. Personnel rotated home, replaced by smaller cohorts of peacetime sailors. The massive repair facilities that had once worked around the clock now operated on day shifts. The base was shrinking without officially being reduced. Admiral Louis Denfeld, soon to be appointed Chief of Naval Operations, toured the facilities with a small group of senior officers. His mission was assessment. The Navy Department needed to make decisions about the post-war fleet structure, and those decisions would determine the fate of bases from the Aleutians to the Caribbean. Denfeld understood the politics. He understood that Congress, facing pressure to cut taxes and fund domestic programs, would not maintain a wartime navy in peacetime. But he also understood that the world had not returned to pre-war normalcy. The Soviet Union was not Nazi Germany. It posed a different kind of threat, one that required different responses. But it was a threat nonetheless. The question was how to make Congress and the American people understand this without sounding like warmongers. Denfeld's tour took him through the submarine base, where boats that had hunted Japanese convoys now sat in mothballs. He visited the fuel depot, where tanks capable of storing tens of millions of gallons remained full, just in case. He inspected the aircraft maintenance facilities, where mechanics worked on planes that hadn't flown combat missions in nearly a year. Everything was maintained. Nothing was being used. It was an empire in waiting. In classified briefings, Denfeld had seen the intelligence estimates. The Soviet Union was developing atomic weapons. Soviet submarines were being built in numbers that would rival the German U-boat fleet. Soviet influence was spreading through Asia, through the Middle East, through Latin America. The next conflict, if it came, would not be fought with battleships and carriers slugging it out in the Philippine Sea. It would be fought with atomic bombs and jet aircraft and missiles. But it would still require bases, forward positions, logistics hubs. The infrastructure that had won the Pacific War would be needed again, in different form, for a different enemy. But how do you convince a war-weary nation to prepare for another war without proof that such a war is imminent? How do you justify spending billions on bases when there's no obvious enemy at the gates? The Japanese had provided clear justification. They had attacked Pearl Harbor. After all, the Soviets were more subtle. They hadn't invaded anyone who mattered to American public opinion. They hadn't bombed American cities. The threat they posed was potential, not actual. And potential threats don't win appropriations battles in Congress. Denfeld made notes. He would recommend a tiered approach, maintain a core of essential bases, Pearl Harbor, Guam, Subic Bay, at full operational capacity. Place others in mothball status, with skeleton crews and preservation routines that would allow rapid reactivation if needed. Abandon the most remote or least strategic positions entirely, salvaging what could be recovered and leaving the rest to rust in the jungle or freeze in the Arctic. It was a compromise. It satisfied no one completely. The fiscal conservatives would complain about waste. The defense hawks would warn about vulnerability. The base commanders would protest the loss of their installations. But it was realistic. It acknowledged that America couldn't maintain a wartime posture indefinitely, but it also refused to return to pre-war isolation. As Denfeld stood on the balcony where Admiral Nimitz had once coordinated the defeat of Japan, he looked out at the harbor and thought about the battleships still resting on the bottom. Arizona, Oklahoma, Utah. The men entombed in those steel coffins had not died so that America could retreat back into isolation. They had died so that America would be strong enough to prevent such attacks from ever happening again. The bases were part of that strength, visible symbols of American power. reminders to potential adversaries that the United States Navy could project force anywhere on Earth. But symbols require maintenance. And maintenance requires money. And money requires political will. Denfeld filed his report and hoped it would be enough. Guam, Mariana Islands, September 1946. 1 year after the war's end, Guam had become what Pearl Harbor had been in 1941, the westernmost major American base in the Pacific, the forward edge of American naval power. Unlike many bases that faced uncertain futures, Guam's strategic importance was unquestionable. It sat astride the shipping lanes to Asia. It provided a staging point for operations anywhere in the western Pacific. It had been American territory since 1898, and the Chamorro people who inhabited the island had remained loyal even during brutal Japanese occupation. The naval base here was vast. Docks capable of handling aircraft carriers, airfields that could accommodate the new jet aircraft beginning to enter service, supply depots carved into the island's volcanic hills, housing for thousands of personnel. Much of it had been built during the war's final year, after American forces retook Guam from the Japanese in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Campaign. The island still bore scars from that battle. Concrete pillboxes overgrown with jungle, coral reefs scattered with shell casings, caves where Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man. Captain William Callahan, the base's supply officer, faced a unique problem. Unlike bases that were being mothballed or closed, Guam was being expanded. New facilities were under construction. New equipment was arriving. The Navy Department had decided that Guam would be the cornerstone of America's Pacific presence in the post-war era. But the personnel to staff this expansion were not materializing. Demobilization had stripped the Navy of experienced sailors and officers. The men arriving at Guam now were fresh recruits, many of them drafted during the war's final months, trained hastily, with none of the combat experience or institutional knowledge of the wartime Navy. Callahan watched these young sailors stumble through tasks that veteran crews had performed flawlessly. He saw equipment mishandled, procedures ignored, efficiency that had been second nature during the war now lost to bureaucratic confusion. The infrastructure remained. The docks, the warehouses, the fuel depots, but the human capital that had made that infrastructure function was gone. You couldn't mothball institutional knowledge. You couldn't put expertise in storage and expect to reactivate it when needed. This, Callahan realized, was the hidden cost of demobilization. The bases could be maintained, the equipment could be preserved, but the thousands of small skills, the welding techniques, the maintenance shortcuts, the unwritten procedures that made complex organizations function, those were walking out the door every time a veteran went home. And they weren't being replaced. The new Navy was smaller, younger, less experienced. It operated bases designed for a force 3 times its size. The result was inefficiency, waste, and a growing sense that the infrastructure had outgrown the institution. But there was something else happening at Guam, something Callahan only half understood. The Chamorro people, who had endured Japanese occupation with remarkable resistance, now watched as America built what looked like a permanent presence on their island. The promises made during the war, that Guam would be developed, that Chamorro citizens would share in post-war prosperity, were being kept, but in unexpected ways. The naval base employed thousands of local workers. American dollars flowed through the island's economy. Schools and hospitals built for military dependents also served civilians. Guam was being integrated into the American system in ways that went far beyond colonial administration. The Japanese had occupied Guam and tried to erase its American identity. They had banned English, forced children to learn Japanese, executed anyone suspected of disloyalty. The occupation had been brief, less than 3 years, but brutal. When American forces liberated the island, Chamorro civilians emerged from hiding waving American flags they had concealed at risk of death. That loyalty had not been coerced. It had been earned, over decades of American administration that, while imperfect, had been vastly preferable to Japanese militarism. Now, as the naval base expanded, Guam's future was being decided. It would not be abandoned. It would not be mothballed. It would become a permanent American installation, perhaps eventually a state or a more autonomous territory. The base was no longer just military infrastructure. It was a promise, a commitment, a statement that America, having once failed to defend its Pacific territories, would never make that mistake again. Callahan filed his reports documenting the challenges of maintaining such a massive base with inadequate personnel. He requested more staff, better training programs, increased budgets for local recruitment. Some of his requests were approved. Others were denied. The Navy Department was still figuring out what post-war America looked like. But at Guam, at least, the decision had been made. This base would endure. Washington, D.C. December 1946. In the bowels of the Navy Department building, in offices still lit by wartime fluorescent fixtures and heated by radiators that clanged and hissed, a small group of planners assembled the final report on base disposition. 16 months of surveys, inventories, inspections, and assessments had been condensed into a document several hundred pages long. It contained maps, charts, cost projections, strategic analyses. It attempted to answer a question that had no perfect answer. What should America do with the greatest naval infrastructure ever built? The recommendations were pragmatic and painful. Of the 400 major installations operated by the Navy during the war, fewer than 50 would remain at full operational status. Another 100 would be maintained in reduced operational capacity, mothballed but not abandoned, capable of reactivation within 6 months to a year. The rest would be closed, their equipment salvaged or sold, their facilities demolished or turned over to local authorities. Some closures were obvious. The forward bases built to support specific campaigns, Ulithi, Eniwetok, Manus, had served their purpose and would be returned to their pre-war status as remote islands inhabited by small populations. The infrastructure would be stripped, the fuel tanks drained, the Quonset huts dismantled or simply abandoned to the elements. In 20 years, jungle would reclaim what American bulldozers had carved from coral and rock. Other closures were more controversial. Bases in the Caribbean, built to protect the Panama Canal and Atlantic Sea lanes from U-boats, would be dramatically reduced. The Atlantic was no longer a war zone. The German Navy had ceased to exist. The British, French, and Italian navies were shadows of their former strength. The Soviet Union had no surface fleet capable of challenging American control of Atlantic waters. The bases weren't needed, at least, not for their original purpose. But the planners knew something the public didn't. The bases were never just about the war that had been fought. They were about the wars that might be fought. Every installation that remained operational, every facility kept in mothballs, every fuel depot, an ammunition dump and repair yard represented options. Flexibility. The ability to respond to crises not yet imagined. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor because they believed America lacked the will and capability to project power across the Pacific. The bases ensured that no future enemy would make the same miscalculation. The report went to Congress in January 1947. Debate was fierce. Fiscal conservatives demanded deeper cuts. Defense hawks warned that reductions would leave America vulnerable. Newspaper editorials argued both sides. The American public, polled repeatedly, expressed contradictory desires. They wanted lower taxes and smaller government, but they also wanted security and strength. They wanted the boys to come home, but they also wanted to ensure that no future enemy would dare attack American territory. In the end, Congress approved most of the Navy Department's recommendations, with modifications. Budgets were cut less severely than fiscal conservatives wanted, but more severely than defense planners preferred. The compromise satisfied no one and frustrated everyone, which was probably proof that it was reasonable. The bases that survived became something new. They were no longer wartime installations, operating at frantic tempo to support combat operations. They were peacetime garrisons, maintained at reduced capacity, serving as symbols of American power and as insurance against future conflict. They were expensive. They were inefficient. They were, in many ways, contradictions, military installations in a nation that desperately wanted to believe it was done with militarism. But they endured. Subic Bay, Philippines. July 1950. 5 years after Japan's surrender, Commander David Richardson arrived at Subic Bay to take command of the naval station. He had been here before, briefly, in 1945, and the changes shocked him. The sprawling Quonset hut cities were gone, replaced by permanent concrete structures. The muddy roads had been paved. The temporary piers had been rebuilt in reinforced concrete. Subic Bay had transformed from a wartime improvisation into a permanent base, one of the largest American military installations outside the continental United States. And then, on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Within days, the United Nations authorized military intervention. Within weeks, American forces were deploying to Korea. And Subic Bay, mothballed and quiet for 5 years, roared back to life. Ships arrived in numbers not seen since 1945. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, all requiring fuel, ammunition, supplies. The base that had been operating with a skeleton crew of a few hundred suddenly needed thousands of personnel. The warehouses that had been half-empty filled with crates marked for Korea. The repair facilities, maintained but rarely used, worked around the clock again. The decision to keep Subic Bay operational, to resist the temptation to close it entirely, suddenly looked prescient. Richardson worked 20-hour days coordinating the logistics surge. He called in favors, cut through bureaucracy, requisitioned supplies from depots across the Pacific. He watched the old veterans, the men who had been here in 1945, slip back into wartime routines as if the 5-year interlude had been a brief pause rather than a different world. The young sailors, who had joined the Navy in peacetime and expected comfortable garrison duty, suddenly understood what their older colleagues had always known: peace is temporary. Vigilance is permanent. The Korean War vindicated the decision to maintain forward bases. American forces deployed to Korea from Japan, from Okinawa, from Guam, from the Philippines. The logistics network that had defeated Japan now supported a different war on the Asian mainland. The bases that critics had called wasteful and unnecessary became essential. The infrastructure that had been built to project power across the Pacific proved adaptable to new challenges. But the Korean War also revealed the limits of naval power. This was not an island-hopping campaign where carriers and amphibious forces could dominate. This was a land war, fought across mountains and rice paddies, where air power and logistics mattered more than battleships. The bases supported the war effort, but they didn't win it. And when the war ended in stalemate and armistice rather than victory, questions about their value returned. Richardson left Subic Bay in 1952, promoted to captain, reassigned to Washington. He had spent 2 years overseeing the transformation of a peacetime base back into a wartime hub. He had proven that the infrastructure could be reactivated, that the institutional knowledge hadn't been completely lost, that the decision to maintain forward bases had been correct. But he also understood that each war was different. The bases built for World War II had supported Korea, but would they be relevant for whatever came next? Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 1966. 25 years after the attack that brought America into World War II, Pearl Harbor remained the symbolic and operational heart of the Pacific Fleet. But it was a different fleet now. The battleships were gone, sold for scrap or turned into museums. The carriers were larger, nuclear-powered, capable of operations unimaginable in 1941. The submarines ran silent beneath the waves, carrying nuclear missiles that could destroy entire cities. The infrastructure that had supported conventional warfare now supported something far more terrible: the capacity for mutual assured destruction. Admiral Thomas Moorer, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, looked out at the harbor from the same balcony where Nimitz had stood in 1945. The water was crowded with ships, but they bore little resemblance to the vessels of World War II. These were Cold War machines, sleek, fast, bristling with missiles and radar and electronic warfare equipment. The war they were designed to fight would not be won by industrial production and logistics superiority. It would be decided in minutes, by nuclear weapons launched from submarines or bombers, before supply chains and bases even mattered. And yet the bases endured. Pearl Harbor, Subic Bay, Guam, Yokosuka in Japan, Sasebo. These installations, built for a different kind of war, had adapted to new missions. They supported carrier battle groups enforcing containment policy against the Soviet Union. They maintained the naval presence that reassured allies and deterred adversaries. They projected American power without firing a shot, simply by existing, proof that the United States could operate anywhere in the Pacific, indefinitely, with overwhelming force. The Vietnam War was raging now, and the bases played their familiar role. Subic Bay became a rest and recreation port for sailors and Marines rotating out of combat zones. Guam's airfields hosted B-52 bombers flying missions over North Vietnam. Pearl Harbor coordinated logistics for an ever-expanding military commitment in Southeast Asia. The infrastructure built to defeat Japan now supported a war that had no clear objective and no end in sight. Moorer understood the irony. The bases had been maintained to prevent another Pearl Harbor, to ensure that America would never again be caught unprepared. But preparedness had its own costs. The forward bases made intervention easier, commitment more likely. They were tools of peace, but they were also tools of war. And tools, once forged, demand to be used. The bases outlasted the Cold War. They outlasted the Soviet Union. They remain operational today, in the 21st century, more than 75 years after World War II ended. Some have been expanded. Guam is once again being developed as a major strategic hub. Others have been closed. Subic Bay was turned over to the Philippines in 1992, ending nearly a century of American naval presence there. But the system endures, a network of installations across the Pacific and around the world, projecting American power, supporting American strategy, costing billions of dollars annually. What really happened to America's World War II naval bases after the war ended? They became permanent. Not by grand design, not because anyone in 1945 envisioned a global network of bases lasting 3/4 of a century, but because each moment of potential retreat, each opportunity to close bases and bring forces home, confronted a new crisis that demanded forward presence. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the Gulf Wars, the War on Terror. Each conflict justified maintaining the infrastructure a little longer. Each peace proved temporary. The bases are artifacts of a different age, when wars were won by industrial production and logistics networks, when victory meant occupying enemy territory and maintaining garrisons indefinitely. But they persist because the fundamental logic remains unchanged. Security requires vigilance. Freedom requires strength. And strength requires infrastructure, unglamorous, expensive, easy to take for granted, but essential nonetheless. The sailors who built Ulithi Atoll from coral and sweat, who carved Adak Island from frozen tundra, who transformed Subic Bay from jungle into a city, they believed they were building temporary facilities to win a specific war. They never imagined their work would endure for generations. But in the vast calculus of history, the bases they built mattered more than the battles they supported. The battles determined who won the war. The bases determined what kind of peace would follow. And so they remain: Pearl Harbor, Guam, Yokosuka, and dozens more. Silent monuments to a war that ended long ago, but whose consequences, whose infrastructure, whose commitments, whose vision of American power, persist still. The Japanese officers who signed the surrender on the Missouri believed they were witnessing the end of something. They were actually witnessing a beginning. The bases proved it. America had not come to the Pacific to win a war and leave. America had come to stay. The sun sets over Pearl Harbor now as it did in 1945, casting long shadows across water that still bears witness to fire and sacrifice and transformation. The carriers and destroyers anchored in the harbor are different models, serving different purposes, crewed by sailors born decades after the war ended. But the base itself, the docks and fuel depots and repair facilities, those remain. Modified, updated, expanded, but fundamentally the same. Infrastructure built for one war, maintained for the next, enduring into a century no one in 1945 could have predicted. That is what really happened to America's World War II naval bases. They didn't end. They evolved. And in that evolution lies a truth about power and commitment that every generation must learn anew. The hardest part of victory is not winning the war. It is deciding what to do with the peace.